This is a introductory webinar for regulators on cannabis synthetics. Today, our presenters are Leslie Engelking she's the founder of the Foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards, otherwise known as FOCUS. And for some of you that have been involved in the AFTO AEC, I'm sure you've seen her and maybe even heard her present. And then joining her today is Dr. Chris Hudala, who's President and Chief Scientific Officer of Pro Verde Labs. And I'm going to turn it over to Leslie, but we have a couple of notes. One is we will be taking questions in the chat. And Leslie and Chris have graciously agreed to take those questions and actually provide a document with all the answers so everybody gets them. And all of you are muted, and you will stay muted throughout the webinar. So just make sure you put those questions into the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie.
Thank you. Hello. As Brooke said, I'm Leslie Engelking. If you're familiar with AFTO over the last, 7 years or so, you're probably familiar with me. I host their cannabis committee, and FOCUS serves as the cannabis regulatory partner for AFTO. So I'm the founder of FOCUS, which is Foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards. I started FOCUS in 2014 after spending 3 years as a medical cannabis business owner. My background previously to that was in mental health, public health, and then from that I went in and spent 13 years in the pharmaceutical industry. So cannabis wasn't my plan. It was kind of a new thing. I'm from Arizona, and we had legalized it here for medical use in 2010. So I have some firsthand experience as a business owner in this space and an operator. And it was through that experience that I decided to leave and start FOCUS as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And FOCUS writes standards. We provide third-party certification. We do a lot of consulting. Basically, we're here to just help this industry get better. Really, our goal is a safe, legal, and sustainable cannabis industry. And so we work with regulators and operators and consumers to help make that happen. Amy, can you go 2 slides, please? Sorry, I just kind of talked over the first one. So we're going to start today talking about the 2018 Farm Bill. And as I'm sure everybody on this call realizes, there was the legalization of hemp production under USDA, but there was not a lot of, there wasn't any controls or any regulations for manufacturing the product. And so we ended up with just this surplus of hemp being grown that was being used to be extracted for CBD. Amy, will you go to the next slide? I think I should have done, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to not see. This really, the scariest part about this is there were state programs, and then there's now this federal program, and there's no regulations for the products. And so as we've seen over the last, 5 years, it's getting worse and worse. People were so excited to grow hemp, and they grew it all. Didn't have anywhere to put it in for products. And so people started making other products. Next slide. And what happened is this really caused a big problem with supply and demand. Within just 45 days of the bill passing, the price of CBD in the marketplace dropped more than 30%. Within a few months, the amount of hemp being grown across the country was just crazy. It went from 32,000 to 146 acres just in a couple months. And what that did was take the price of a single kilo of CBD oil up to $70,000. So it was more than, a barrel of gas, that price. And then when we looked in 2022, the same kilo was $750 because of this oversupply. And that oversupply and all that material led the industry to try and figure out what to do with all that product. Next slide, please. And that sort of takes us to where we are today. Hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids are everywhere. Chris and I were talking about this yesterday as we were preparing for this webinar, and we were talking about how maybe you've never seen a certain type of car and somebody points one out to you, or you're going to go looking for a new car and you decide you're looking one, and all of a sudden you see them everywhere. It's kind of the same thing with these intoxicating cannabinoids that come from hemp. They weren't anywhere and now they're everywhere. And I think for regulators that aren't familiar with this, or if you're in a state where you haven't seen a lot of this, I'm pretty sure that after this webinar, you're going to start noticing them. It's just, they're everywhere. And the problem with this is they're being sold without any age restrictions or quality control, safety measures. And they're being sold in gas stations and convenience stores and anywhere that, just very easy to get. So there's not the system in place like the medical markets to go in and you have to be registered and people can track how much you get. Next slide, please. What is happening is people are taking all this excess CBD oil and they are using chemicals to make different products, and they're intoxicating. Yes, and that's part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that we don't know what kind of chemical conversions are happening. We don't know what chemical byproducts are happening. And we can't really test for them the way we do in a medical marijuana market. So there's certain states, I believe maybe Alaska, I read yesterday, has decided to regulate hemp-derived cannabinoids under their medical marijuana program or their adult use program. I'm very interested to see how that will go, because you can't test the same way for these products that you would a cannabis product from a legal state system. Because of the chemical conversions, we don't know what to test for. And there's all these downstream byproducts that appear that could be toxic, and we just don't know. Next slide, please. Chris is going to talk more about the science, so I'm trying to stay high level with you guys right now, just to kind of let you know. But I just literally pulled this off Amazon this morning. And when I did a search, I searched for Delta 8. This is what came up. Look at the dosage on here, the potency. It doesn't say anywhere, I couldn't get a good picture of the label, but it really doesn't say anywhere on the label what it is. It has a list of ingredients, but it's everything but the active ingredient. So whatever they're putting into their gummies is listed, just not the hemp component. Next slide. So this is from NCSL as of June, and this is looking at state regulated cannabis programs. You can see the white is where there's no public access. The yellow, the light yellow is comprehensive medical cannabis, the blue is adult use, and the grayish is adult and medical. A lot of the states that are seeing much heavier and problematic cases with these synthetics are in the states that have legalized cannabis later. So this big experiment of ours has been going on for almost a decade now, and sort of moved across the country west to east. And the South has been sort of the last to get in, not Florida, but kind of Midwest South. And so those states, because they have cannabis prohibition, people are wanting these products more. And you can hear a lot of different things about the products, but what most people call them is like weed light. So Delta 8 is a cannabinoid that is grown in the cannabis plant naturally, but to make enough Delta 8 to put into these products, you have to convert it from CBD. And so they're not natural, they're synthetic, and then that gets you high. And so people want these products because they're not able to go into a dispensary and buy the other things. It's causing a lot of havoc. I want to just make a point too, that it's causing a lot of these synthetic products are making their way into the regulated programs. So I've worked with multiple states over the last couple of years that have had problems with synthetics, and some states actually allow them. Utah allows them in. It's an interesting discussion when you kind of go through this and you say, okay, well, how many, like what levels are you going to let in? What is the safety data on this? Because there really isn't any safety data on this. And so it's a very difficult thing to regulate. We don't know what the implications are. Next slide, please. So one of the things that was our goal today was to try and give you some things to look at on labels to know. So a lot of what happens is nomenclature in the cannabis industry is all over the place. So these products can be called anything from synthetic to derivatives to analogs to cannabis related to THC light. There's all sorts of names, and even states don't call it the same thing. And so it becomes hard to recognize. The other part that makes it difficult is that industry is always going faster than government. And so the minute a state says, oh, I'm going to control one of these cannabinoids, another one pops up. And so it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole right now, not only state by state, but even within a state. So what we wanted to do was give you some indication of what to look for in a label. Next slide, please. So I wanted to make this slide very obvious to show you just how many different things that are different ways these products are showing up. All of these things are synthetic analogs, products of concern. And when you start looking at labels, you'll see Delta-9 THC, which is the THC that comes from cannabis, but you might also see Delta-9 THC derived from hemp. You can see THCA, THCP, THCX, and it's getting more and more difficult to recognize what that is by these labels. So it's really important that consumers know this, but it's also important as regulators when you're going into these shops and stuff to know which products are actually synthetically made and have undergone a chemical conversion because of the safety aspect of it. Chris, do you want to add anything here on recognizing these products?
Yeah, just when we work with a lot of state regulators and law enforcement, and oftentimes when we have these discussions, they literally have no idea what's being sold under their nose in their state. And when we start surveying their marketplace, we see all of these acronyms being thrown around, and oftentimes law enforcement and regulators aren't really aware of what these are. And so it's quite a surprise to them when we explain what is being sold in their state, especially when we describe the safety risks associated with those products.
Perfect. Thank you. Next slide, Amy. Oh, that one's kind of messy. Anyway, so we wanted to talk a little bit about the different cannabinoid exposures. According to the Poison Centers of America, the first reported case of any kind of exposure that ended up in an emergency room was in 2008. There was a slow but steady increase through 2014. And now all 50 states have reported these health effects. Some of them are just people that are uncomfortable because they got high and they thought they had CBD and they weren't expecting that. And so it scares them. But people are dying. And Chris has got a lot of, well, you want to tell one of your stories about the kid that had trouble?
We hear quite a few of them, but it's not uncommon for us to get phone calls at the laboratory from concerned parents. In one case, a child was seeing a physician who actually recommended, based on anxiety, some CBD gummies. And as they go to the a local vape store to buy some CBD gummies. The vendor convinced him to buy Delta 8 because Delta 8 was really what they needed. And so this child, he was, well, he wasn't a child, but he was probably 16, started consuming these Delta 8 gummies, not understanding what the effects were. And he had a bad reaction to whatever was in the gummy, and it ended him in the emergency room, quite serious. Luckily, he's okay, but it caused quite a scare for both him as well as the rest of his family.
Yeah, and we hear about these all the time. I mean, the scary part is teenagers and children are getting into them too. So there's been a couple of really bad incidents with young children ingesting their parents' hemp gummies, and because they're sold online and without oversight, they're not necessarily tamper resistant or anything else. So they're everywhere, and it's scary because people can get into them. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the legal versus not legal and where the laws are, because the Farm Bill says hemp is legal, certain things are okay. DEA says other things are not okay. So the DEA has confirmed that Delta 8, if it's extracted from hemp biomass that's grown in the USA, it's exempt from the CSA. But in 2021, there was an email from the DEA section chief that clarified that if you create Delta 8 by a chemical reaction from CBD, it makes that product synthetic, and that is not exempted by the Farm Bill. You can see just by how carefully I'm wording the things here, how delicate this is, right? And again, I think nomenclature plays a big role. Chemicals, reactions, synthetic, derivatives. We have to be careful. So can we go to the next slide to make sure that when we're looking at this information, that we know what we're talking about, even just when trying to pull sources for this. It's very easy to get conflicting information about this. And I think that's part of the challenge, is we don't have any good direction overall from the federal level, which is obviously the challenge with cannabis overall. So DEA hasn't addressed all of these different THC isomers that we've talked about, but they have provided guidance that THCO in particular is a Schedule I drug because it does not occur naturally, which one would think then any of these synthetic byproducts would also be deemed controlled substances because they do not exist naturally. Next slide, please. So it's an interesting thing though, because we have, as you saw the slide before, we have all these different states that are regulating this. Some are banning, some are putting certain limitations on them. Most states specifically address natural and synthetic isomers of THC. It's often in a state's rules under their existing code for Schedule I. But these codes often mirror the federal Controlled Substance Act. And so the question kind of becomes, which has more power, right? Which authority is greater? When states are having a hard time figuring out how to regulate these and looking at what to do, it's really important that you also look at your state code and see what it says about Schedule I substances, not just the marijuana code or the hemp code. But and I think that is a good example of just how challenging this is, because cannabis hits so many different areas and you're always kind of looking at different things. I asked a couple people, and I know Chris has asked an attorney on a webinar about this last week, and we haven't really gotten an answer to this, which takes priority or precedence as far as the state code. But but it's important to work to look at that stuff. I think we've seen, and even in like medical cannabis programs, a lot of times states don't reference the right existing regulations from other sections and then end up creating competing regulations. We were just helping with that in a state the other day. So it's important to consider all the different ways where cannabis is regulated and go from there. Next slide. Oh, this is out of order, but this is more of the poison control data. So the legend is pretty small on there. I don't know if you can see it, but the white is from 1 to 14, and the pink is the highest one on here. It's 27 to 40. So these are just exposures across the country, but you can see they're growing. And it's interesting because this is only since January this year. So while that doesn't seem like a lot, it is a tremendous increase from what it has been previously. There was a health action or health alert network from the CDC recently that showed they looked at the increases in synthetic cannabinoid reporting and incidents from just prior to COVID until now. And it was just a huge dramatic increase. They had they compared that with the 3 years before COVID, and it was double at the starting number. So these are problems that we're seeing. People are, suffering, and kids are getting into them, and it's stuff that it's important to be aware of, because I'm sure as regulators, you're going to get questions. Next slide. Oh, I guess that's it. So I'll probably talk a little bit more at the end with Chris, but I wanted to turn it over to him now to get into some of the science and scary stuff.
All right, thank you very much. I'll just tell you a little bit about my background here. And I can get it to go forward. I have my PhD in analytical chemistry with about 35 years of academic and industrial research. In 2013, I started Proverty Laboratories, and as one of the first or among the first ISO 17025 accredited laboratories that focus specifically on cannabis. And as such, we provide services for the Massachusetts regulatory marijuana program, but we also provide testing services for a broader class of customers that are focused on hemp and CBD products. I want to read a quote that somebody just shared with me the other day because it's so pertinent. It was by President Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "The public welfare outweighs the right to private gain. No man may poison the people for his private profit." Keep thinking about that as we go through this presentation and look at what we see. If you notice the map that Leslie ended up with, there were more reports of incidents in states where marijuana is not fully legalized yet. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about Delta 8. Why is Delta 8 such a thing? So as Leslie said, the hemp was legalized under the Farm Bill, so therefore CBD extracted from hemp is natural and legal. There has been trace levels of Delta 8 THC observed in hemp biomass. Even though it's not produced directly by the plant, it is a natural degradation product that happens on the plant. And so since Delta 8 THC is naturally occurring, a derivative pathway from CBD for production should be legal. That's the thought path of the industry in general. The problem with that thought path, though, is that the conversion of CBD into Delta 8 THC is not a natural process. Many isomers are formed in the process that do not occur naturally. And so this presents both legal questions and consumer safety questions that arise from the unknown isomers and contaminants that are part of these mixtures. We oftentimes hear people referring to natural Delta 8, saying, "Oh, my Delta 8 is natural." Well, the reality is that in nature, Delta 8 is found at very, very trace levels, less than 0.001%. It would require 55,000 kilograms of hemp biomass to yield 1 kilogram of natural Delta 8 THC that could be used to make gummies or vape pens. At $400 per kilo of biomass, the raw plant material alone to produce that 1 kilo of Delta 8 would cost $22 million. It's estimated that by the time you extract that concentrate and purify it, that the cost of Delta-8 extract, which could be used for production, would be somewhere between $200 million and $500 million per kilogram. So it's economically impractical. So take home lesson one for today is if you see somebody claiming that their Delta-8 is natural, that is not true. There is some significant rationale for the production of Delta-8. It has a high potential for therapeutic and recreational applications. And so we see it very popular in markets where marijuana is not legal yet. It's scientifically interesting, like most minor cannabinoids. There's been some significant research done with Delta-8. One of the first studies was in pediatric oncology, where they treated patients with Delta-8 THC to obtain the same benefits as Delta-9 THC, but with less psychoactivity associated with it. And that was important for the children. Delta-8 is relatively easy to produce. Currently, that's without any regulatory oversight, but it takes very little investment, very little equipment to actually produce it. In addition, as Leslie was saying, with the oversupply of CBD, the market prices for CBD decreased significantly. A lot of investors were upside down in their investments, and so conversion of that CBD to THC represents a value-added product and was seen as a salvation for many of the investors who were hoping at a much earlier point to get FDA approval for CBD, which still has not happened. But there's many concerns for us that surround the Delta-8. It is potential for intoxication with Delta-8 use. Delta-8 is psychoactive, less so than Delta-9, but so we see producers making much higher concentration products. We see gummies that are 200, 400 milligrams of Delta-8. These would be extremely psychoactive. The other thing is that much of the legislation that has benefited hemp has been based on arguments that hemp is not psychoactive or intoxicating. And now that there are pathways for intoxicating hemp derivatives, could have negative consequences to the future of cannabis legislation. In addition, these unregulated products are cutting into regulated cannabis profits. So in most states where there are regulated marijuana programs, the producers spend enormous amounts of money on licensing and insurance and operating a business in a regulatory environment that these producers of these Delta-8 products are not having those same costs, and so they can undercut the prices significantly. As an analytical laboratory, our main concern is from a consumer safety standpoint. As I said, these are all produced without regulatory oversight. We see many unidentified contaminants in these products. We've tested close to 5,000 products and intermediates, and to date, we have not seen one that did not have these contaminants in them. For these contaminants that we see, there's no efficacy or toxicity information available. So we don't know what these are doing to consumers. We don't know what they're doing to their body. There have been many regulatory and consumer safety groups that have issued statements. The FDA and CDC both put out a report, I believe it was last year, talking about the health concerns associated with these products. Focus, United States Pharmacopoeia, American Herbal Products Association, U.S. Hemp Authority, Hemp Industry Association have all acknowledged in public statements that without regulation, there are some serious health concerns associated with these products. So there's going to be some definitions today. So in order to understand what we're talking about, there's some terms that some people aren't familiar with. And so the first term I'm going to use is phytocannabinoids. The term phytocannabinoid refers to a cannabinoid that's produced by the cannabis plant, a natural cannabinoid. Examples include THCA, CBDA, and CBGA. That A at the end of them designates the acidic form of a cannabinoid. I'll talk more about that in a minute. While not produced directly by the plant, there's natural degradation processes that occur in the plant that reduce those THCA, CBDA, and CBGA to their neutral form. And that's where we see the Delta-9 THC, CBD, CBG, and sometimes CBN. These cannabinoids are not actually produced by the plant, but they are natural degradants of the cannabinoids that are produced by the plant. These cannabinoids then are often extracted for production of consumer products like gummies, chocolates, vape devices. Those are all coming from natural cannabinoids or phytocannabinoids. When we talk about synthetic cannabinoids, the synthetic refers to chemical compounds that are created through a chemical process by human agency. And I've bolded that because that is the key here, human agency, as to those opposed to natural origin. Sometimes synthetic compounds imitate natural products like marinol or dronabinol, which is a synthetic delta-9. Synthetic compounds may be created that do not exist in nature, like THC acetate or THCO. And sometimes these synthetic compounds are unintentional. They're created during processing of cannabis extracts, and sometimes you have side reactions and you have conversions from one cannabinoid to another. That was not really the target of your processing activity, and so those are unintentional. We see examples of all of these. So on the top, I have the intentional synthesis of a natural cannabinoid, dronabinol or marinol. Delta-9 THC, it's available through the pharmaceutical industry, is used to treat anorexia and other medical conditions. It is a pharmaceutical compound. You can take delta-9 THC from cannabis or hemp, and you can do an acetylation reaction where you basically add on an acetate group. And I've circled that, and this is an intentional synthesis of a non-natural compound. So THC acetate does not exist in nature. But the addition of that acetate group makes it cross the blood-brain barrier faster. So it makes the cannabinoid more available in the human body. So it might get you stoned faster, it might make it last longer. I've also included an example of an unintentional synthesis where during a simple distillation of delta-9 THC, which is a common activity in cannabis processing to purify the delta-9 THC, sometimes you get the movement of that double bond. This is a movement from a delta-9 position to a delta-10 position. When we talk about delta-9 and delta-10 and delta-8, the delta is referring to the double bond. The number is referring to where in that ring that bond occurs. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Isomer is another important concept to talk about. The term isomer refers to compounds with the same chemical formula, but a different arrangement or connectivity of atoms in the molecule. So the delta-9 molecule, which I've shown on the left, and the delta-8 molecule, they only differ by the position of the double bond or the delta-9 or delta-8. But I've also included the chemical formula there, and you can see that they have the same chemical formula. So delta-9 and delta-8 are considered isomers. The molecule THC is actually quite complex, and I've included the numbering so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. But THC has 30 different isomers that are all THC, depending on where the double bond is and depending on where some of the other hydrogens are positioned, whether they're pointing up or pointing down. But basically, of these 30 THC isomers, there's only one that is produced in nature by the cannabis plant. With subsequent degradation, we see some of the delta-8 as well. So you could say that only 2 of them are ever found in nature, but the other 28 may be produced during the synthetic conversion of CBD to THC, as you have less control during that synthesis. Mother Nature does a great job at synthesis, humans not quite so much. Why do isomers matter? We're going to go back to the late 50s, a drug called thalidomide. It was a drug that was promoted for the treatment of anxiety, sleep disorders, tension, and morning sickness. This was an isomer. We call it a chiral. It's a special form of isomer, but it's a chiral molecule where it had a right-handed and a left-handed isomer. And I show those on the right. You can see that the connection with the nitrogen, or the N, one of them is a dark triangle, one of them is a dashed triangle. Those are nomenclature in chemistry trying to show direction going up or going down, but they have 2 different orientations at that point. Because of its properties, it was used extensively for pregnant women and affected over 10,000 people. The R form was the form that was responsible for the sedative effects. Unfortunately, the S form was teratogenic or caused horrific birth defects. So it wasn't uncommon in that time to see babies born with no limbs or horribly configured. And many of them, as I said, did not make it through birth. The drug itself was used widely in Canada, Great Britain, Germany, Australia, but it was not approved for use in the FDA. And that's the result from Frances Oldham Kelsey, who was a pharmacologist and medical reviewer with the FDA. During the review process, she commented, "An interesting collection of meaningless pseudoscientific jargon apparently intended to impress chemically unsophisticated readers." When I read that, it hit me as particularly important because that's what I think when I hear people justifying the Delta-8 craze. It brings that comment to light. The conversion of CBD into THC is nothing new. It was first published by Roger Adams in 1941. Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, who's oftentimes viewed as the grandfather of cannabis, he worked a lot with it in studies, and they filed a patent in 2004. Those pathways for the conversion of CBD into THC usually employ some kind of acidic conditions, sometimes with the addition of catalysts. But this information kind of sat in the literature kind of unknown, or at least to the majority of the industry. It was kind of hidden until this oversupply of CBD, when somebody dug it out and decided this was the new pathway to make gold. So how do you make these synthetic Delta-8? Well, CBD can be extracted from hemp, and it can be very easily purified into a white crystalline powder. Oftentimes we see it as pharmaceutical grade. That's 99.99% purity. So it's very high purity. Because of the oversupply, it's very inexpensive these days. It starts with a simple dissolving it in your organic solvent, like benzene or toluene, no different than dissolving sugar in water. So you're simply dissolving this isolate in an organic solvent. The solvents themselves are typically carcinogenic or toxic, but the CBD is very happy in that medium and so dissolves quite readily. To that mixture, then, you add an acid like hydrochloric acid or para-toluene sulfonic acid. There's a number of different acids that can be used. That mixture then is refluxed at high temperature. So you're basically heating it, and as it evaporates or steam goes up and condenses and falls back down. So it's kind of a repetitive process of heating. And during that process, the CBD then is going to structurally reorganize the molecules to form either the Delta-8 or the Delta-9 THC isomer, as well as some others. After that, you have to neutralize the acid and then remove that solvent. Typically, that's done with a rotovap, where the solvent is using vacuum and temperature, removing the solvent, and that leaves behind in your reaction vessel the Delta-8 or Delta-9 THC. So it's relatively simple. It can be done pretty inexpensively. I've heard of people doing this in their garage using paint thinner and battery acid, because it doesn't matter what kind of solvent you use or acid you use. What does impact it is the purity of your final product. But so the intent of this whole reaction is take CBD with your acid and convert it to Delta-8 THC. And that's what people think they are doing. Unfortunately, what they're actually doing is they're creating a number of other isomers. These isomers are not found in nature other than the Delta-9. And so we don't know much about their toxicity. In addition to those other THC isomers, we're also seeing the creation of other chemical compounds, different rearrangements. In many respects, these are like Frankenstein molecules, where the atoms are arranged in a manner that was not intended by nature. My mother made the best beef stew, and everybody has their own beef stew recipe, and they all taste different. And even though I have her recipe, I can't make it taste the same. Very similarly, the standard operating procedures used to create these Delta-8 products are very specific to the producer who's making it. Each different process, each different standard operating procedure will create a different profile of contaminants. So it's very difficult to understand or create rules for identifying these contaminants. This is what a typical chromatography looks like for these. This is what we look at in the lab. We've collected so many of these, I can see these with my eyes closed and the back of my eyelids. But anything I've marked in red, these are chemical compounds that are not found in nature. And this is a vape pen. People are going to be inhaling these different isomers of THC, these different question mark compounds, without understanding what they are, what they do in the human body. But we see these patterns for almost every product that we look at, whether it's a gummy or a chocolate or a vape pen. This is an example of a gummy. 47% of the chemical signal is due to compounds not found in nature. That's alarming. And these products are probably available to your children. In addition, the laboratories that are providing the testing are using testing methodologies that oftentimes hide the contaminants. On the left, I show a liquid chromatography. This is a hemp gummy. It's actually available on Amazon.com, Delta 8. And you can see that in that gummy, there are contaminants that are hiding underneath the Delta 8 sample. And I've shown the contaminants, the Delta 4 iso-THC and the Delta 8 iso-THC on the bottom in red. And those are hiding behind the Delta 8. So any concentration of those is added to the Delta 8, because we just look at the Delta 8 area, it's basically overestimating the purity. If instead I analyze that same sample by gas chromatography, I can see that those chemical signals from those contaminants are far removed from the Delta 8. Unfortunately, all the laboratories are using the technology on the left. So almost all of the certificates of analysis that you will see are not going to be accurate. And we were guilty of this as well, because we didn't know early on that there were these contaminants hiding behind the Delta 8 signal. So we call it Delta X because you get Delta 8, Delta 10, Delta 11, Delta 7. Commercially available Delta 8 products represent complex synthetic mixtures. Most laboratories are not reporting these unknown constituents, and so the certificates of analysis are often very unreliable. We're one of the few labs that I know of that we put a statement on our certificate of analysis that says, in addition to the compounds reported here, additional isomers and synthetic byproducts were observed for which no toxicity information exists, and therefore this product would not be recommended for human consumption. We have almost zero return clients for our synthetic products, but I'm okay with that. Essentially, the producers don't know what they're putting in their product, because when they purchase their Delta 8 raw ingredient, those come with a certificate of analysis highlighting the beautiful purity of that Delta 8, which is misleading. And without any regulatory oversight, consumers then have no idea what they're consuming. So when I think about these products, I think about the isomers that don't occur in nature. I think about the synthetic byproducts, these Frankenstein molecules that are created in the process. But I'm also concerned about the residual solvents, acids, and catalysts that are all toxic and used to create these. How adept are producers at removing these from a final product? That depends. Lack of regulation. We oftentimes see one of the biggest infractions for these products is that they're not labeled correctly. They include cannabinoids that aren't in the product, and they don't include any labeling for cannabinoids that are in the product. So it's very challenging, because anything that's on the label, I can almost tell you it's not going to be accurate. Lack of testing methods is very challenging for the laboratories, because oftentimes we don't have the certified reference standards or the methods to be able to test these accurately. Consumers are being misled by the widespread disinformation that the industry has sown. And there's a lack of boundaries. Once synthetic Delta 8 THC became palatable to the consumers, it gave the widespread okay to start creating other analogs like HHC, THCO, THCP, THCJD. It's a whole host of them. So I have to think about different points that we don't know about for these synthetic contaminants. Are they doing liver damage because the body doesn't know how to metabolize these unknown compounds? Will they cause cancer with repeated long-term exposure? Might some of these compounds cause birth defects or miscarriage if consumed during pregnancy? Will some of these compounds interact with other medications that a patient may be taking? And will the use of these products trigger a positive drug test? Some people are taking these products because they don't want to use Delta 9, thinking that they'll test positive in a drug test. We don't know the answer to any of these questions, and that's a huge concern. I used to call this my slide, what's next, but I have to get rid of that and say what's now, because these are now all over the marketplace. There are other synthetic variants on the market. Delta 9 THCP. So normally this carbon chain, this jaggedy line here normally has 5 carbons or 5 points on it. They've now creating new analogs with either 4, 6, 7, or 8. And each one of those is a new chemical compound. They're called analogs. The longer that chain, the more psychoactive it is because it binds more strongly with the receptors in the body. You can also remove that double bond. You can see for HHC, they've removed the delta 9 or the delta 8. There's no longer a double bond in that position. And that creates a compound called hexahydrocannabinol or HHC. That HHC has very similar psychoactivity or intoxicating properties as delta 9 THC. So you can say, well, my product has no THC and yet it'll get you, stoned where you want to get, I guess. You can also have the acetylation. I talked about acetylation before, where addition of the acetate group to the molecule will make that cross the blood-brain barrier easier. And we see them performing this acetylation on HHC, THCP. And so now they're starting to combine these chemical reactions, and it creates a whole list of chemical compounds. And one regulator asked me to theorize how many different products would be available on the market, and I stopped counting after about 400 because there's so many there's so many contaminants in these products, it's just hard to imagine. This is just an example of the acetate for the THC acetate. You can see that all the peaks are shifted to the right, but again, the acetylation reaction where you're adding the acetate is very effective. And so all of the contaminants that are found in a delta 8 THC product then become acetylated contaminants, which means if they were dangerous, they are now more dangerous because they'll enter the body more readily. We see them starting to mix all these together, mixing THCO and delta 8 THC and HHC without any understanding of how to mix these in ratios. Nothing on the packaging tells you the correct amount. And so this is very concerning from a consumer safety standpoint. So just to summarize the technical part of it, the delta 8 has demonstrated potential for both therapeutic and recreational products. I'm oftentimes accused of being anti-synthetics, and I'm really not. I think that synthetics have a place in the market if they're controlled and regulated appropriately. I just don't see that happening yet. And while delta 8 is found in nature, natural sources are impractical. So everything you see in the marketplace is of synthetic origin. Being synthetic, it's always made in an unregulated environment. So it gives rise to many contaminants that we're concerned about. These contaminants don't even have a name in many cases. Most of them, we don't know their toxicity. So most labs that are testing these, when they see these peaks from the contaminants, they're not sure what to call it, so they just ignore it. And that means that all the COAs that you get for these synthetic products are unreliable. Post-synthesis isolation and purification, there are ways to remove these contaminants to create a truly synthetic delta 8 product, but that adds on to the cost of production. And when I show these methods to producers, they say, well, that'll make it more expensive to produce, and nobody's making us do that. So that's where their sentiment is. Now I want to talk about misinformation. I'm not lisping, it's misinformation, data or details not founded on factual evidence intended to exploit the ignorance of others. When Leslie and I were talking about this, we discussed what's the underlying message here. And we want to talk about not so much the science, but it's more about what is in the marketplace, what misinformation is out there, how can we educate people to be aware of what they should be looking for. So some of the comments I hear from regulators and law enforcement and producers in the industry is kind of what I'm going to highlight here. I hear them say, we need to start classifying cannabinoids agnostic to the source as the body processes them the same without cause or concern of source. Delta 8 THC is delta 8 THC, regardless of whether it is natural or synthetic. Natural delta 8 THC does not have the contaminants, does not have these other isomers, does not have the synthetic reagents associated with them. When people start making pure delta 8 THC pharmaceutical grade, then I will say that this is right. But currently what is in the marketplace is not correct. Delta 8 THC is a hemp derivative of the U.S. Farm Bill, is an agricultural product and should be regulated as such. When you add these toxic solvents, acids, and other reagents, we leave the realm of agriculture and enter the world of synthetic organic chemistry, no different from a pharmaceutical environment. These products should be regulated as such because the concerns are very different. For an agricultural product, I'm concerned about pesticides. I'm not worried about pesticides in a Delta-8 synthetic product. I'm worried about synthetic contaminants. I see these being advertised in various misleading ways, 100% organic. Well, if you look at the toxic solvents and acids that go into making these products, there's no way you could consider this 100% organic, just not a thing. Leslie was talking about the availability of these. These are available today on Amazon with no age gate, no restriction, no warning. THC does not appear in the description nor on the label. There's no information, and so you kind of have to know the code in order to see these. And people's Delta hemp gummies, that's the code for these. But if you look at some of the comments that are posted on the Amazon website, this stuff will definitely hit you hard. Next time I will be taking 1/8 of a gummy from now on. So it's not hitting you hard because it's so flavorful and chewy and fruity. It's hitting you hard because of the Delta-8 THC that's in that gummy. I oftentimes hear people say, well, we don't really have a lot of evidence of harm for these products, and therefore they must be safe. Well, that's just not true. While the synthetic compounds have not been studied extensively for safety, the CDC has recorded many adverse events associated with the synthetic cannabinoid products. There was a headline not too long ago that said 4 dead after using synthetic cannabis containing rat poison. I have to believe that a producer did not intentionally add in rat poison, and it was, if you're making it in the basement, it is possible for that to creep its way into your production batch. So again, it's being made in an unregulated environment. Natural Delta-8 THC flower, I hear that all the time. The cannabis plant does not have genetics to produce that. And then the definition of hemp. This veers a little away from the synthetics, but we have to understand what decarboxylation is. The native form of the cannabinoid, as I said in the very beginning, is the acid form. That's because of the carboxylic acid on the THC molecule that I've circled. That compound is not psychotropic. It is only through heating that chemical compound that we produce Delta-9 THC, which is what you get when you smoke a joint, when you inhale, or that's what they're putting in gummies. In the definition of hemp in the Farm Bill, it talks about the any part of the plant species, cannabis sativa, including seeds thereof and all derivatives, extracts, cannabinoids, isomers, etc. Not more than 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. It goes on to say that the measurement, it mandates testing using a decarboxylation or other similarly reliable method to measure the THC. And so it's this last part, using a post-decarboxylation or other similarly reliable method. What is that method? There's 3 of them that can be used. If you use gas chromatography, which used to be the standard, the hot inlet of the gas chromatograph decarboxylates the THCA, so you naturally get that total THC as a measurement. You could heat the flower prior to using liquid chromatography, or you can analyze by liquid chromatography, which will quantitate separately the THC acid and from the THC. The THC is then mathematically or theoretically decarboxylated using this equation shown on the bottom, where the 0.877 is the weight difference between THC and the THCA. It's this last method that is accepted. It's used most widely by all labs, and it's accepted by all federal and state regulatory bodies. So that is pretty much the standard. The problem is we see on the market high THCA hemp flower, where they're saying that this Delta-9 THC with 0.24% by weight is under the 0.3% limit specified in the Farm Bill. The problem is that the THCA is over 32%. So a total THC for that would be approximately 30%. All high THCA hemp flower is no different than black market marijuana. We see this being sold extensively in states where marijuana is not legal. They're sending it through the mail, but it is just black market trade. So current synthetic state cannabis regulators are treating this as an agricultural product. The skills needed to make these products is different than what you would typically find in a cannabis operation. And I oftentimes hear regulators say, well, we'll just have laboratories test for these contaminants. The problem with that is the contaminants haven't been identified. Every producer has a different contaminant profile. Methods don't exist for many of these contaminants, and the certified reference compounds don't exist. In talking to some of the lawyers for the hemp industry, they say that anything made from hemp as a derivative, according to the Farm Bill, becomes a legal commodity. And so if I can take CBD and convert it into heroin, they stand by the fact that that is a legal product. And so it won't be long before we see people selling heroin gummies as a legal Farm Bill compliant product. So with that, I'd like to thank you. And Leslie, do you have anything to add? Short on time here, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Thank you. No, I think what I want to add is just kind of on your last couple slides is that when you look at how cannabis is being regulated in state programs, the emphasis is on third-party testing at the end of the product, and there's not a lot of controls for the process. And so when you start thinking about these synthetics and all the different solvents that can be used, and then all the different contaminants and downstream byproducts that can happen, it's a very different situation than what you see. And I think Chris's point is Delta 8 isn't bad, but these are pharmaceutical products, and there are regulations in cannabis today that are at the level of a pharmaceutical. And so the idea of putting them under a medical program is real scary because there isn't any of that control.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry, this is so quick. We should have probably done a little bit longer, but we appreciate you joining us today. We will be sending out the slides along with the presentation, and give us about a week, and then we will get all your questions answered and sent out to you as well.
You could also reach out to Leslie or myself. Our emails addresses there at the bottom, and I speak for Leslie. We're happy to take questions, or if you have concerns, specific concerns. We both work with regulators in every state, so we're happy to be a resource.
Always. We know this is hard on you guys. Good luck.
It's a lot of information.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having us.